Hello and welcome to Nightmare Lullabies. As you settle in for the night, prepare to be immersed in a world of eerie whispers and unsettling tales, designed to both chill and soothe. Now, close your eyes, relax, and let the darkness carry you away. And if these nightly tales captivate you, feel free to join our community for more whispered secrets. The early morning light seeped through the narrow streets of Athens as Giorgos Karaivaz parked his car outside his home. It was a crisp, cool day in April, and the city hummed with life. People rushing to work, cafes opening their doors, and the distant sounds of honking cars echoing through the urban sprawl. But for Giorgos, the day carried a different weight, a weight that he had felt growing heavier with each passing month. As a veteran crime journalist, Giorgos had spent decades unraveling the web of corruption that seemed to tighten around Greece's most powerful institutions. He was respected by his colleagues, feared by criminals, and most importantly, watched by those who had much to lose if the truth ever reached the public eye. He had built his career on exposing the kind of darkness that thrived in the shadows, the kind of darkness that did not appreciate the intrusion of a journalist's flashlight. Giorgos had just left his office, a small yet well-equipped newsroom where he had been putting together his latest investigative piece. He had been digging into a case that, if exposed, could rock the very foundations of Greek politics and law enforcement. He had uncovered links between high-ranking officials, criminal syndicates, and police officers who had sworn to uphold justice, but were instead profiting from the illicit deals of the underground world. His work was dangerous, but he had never let fear dictate his actions. He had received threats before, anonymous messages warning him to back off, phone calls with voices on the other end that remained silent before abruptly hanging up, even strangers lurking outside his workplace. But this was part of the job. It came with the territory of speaking the truth in a country where silence often proved more profitable. As he stepped out of his car that fateful day, his mind was filled with thoughts of his next steps. He was closer than he had ever been, to proving the undeniable link between organized crime and the very people meant to protect the public. He had secured confidential documents, insider testimonies, and financial records that painted a damning picture of corruption at the highest levels. His hands tightened around the briefcase he carried, filled with notes and evidence that could finally break the story wide open. He had promised his editor that he would deliver the final draft within the next few days. But first, he needed to go home, rest, and prepare for what was to come. But he never made it inside. As he turned toward his front door, a motorcycle suddenly roared up the quiet street. Two masked men dressed in black stopped just feet away from him. Before he could react, one of them pulled out a silenced pistol and aimed it directly at him. The first shot rang out, hitting him in the chest. He staggered back, gasping as pain seared through his body. Another shot followed, then another. The attackers fired 12 rounds in total, 6 of them striking Giorgos, ensuring that he would never reach his front door. He collapsed onto the pavement, his body motionless, his briefcase slipping from his grip. The street, once filled with the normal hum of daily life, was now eerily silent, broken only by the fading sound of the motorcycle disappearing into the distance. Neighbors rushed outside, their horrified gasps filling the air. Someone screamed. Someone else called the police. But by the time help arrived, it was too late. Giorgos Karaivaz, one of Greece's most fearless journalists, lay lifeless on the cold concrete. His work, his investigation, his final story, left unfinished. The news of his assassination spread like wildfire. Colleagues, friends, and press freedom organizations across the globe condemned the act, demanding justice. But those who knew how the system worked feared the worst. Would there be an investigation? Certainly. Would it lead to the killers? Unlikely. And just like that, one of Greece's most shocking assassinations would begin its descent into becoming another unsolved cold case. But some weren't willing to let that happen. Some would continue his work. Some would demand answers. And some would find themselves walking in the very footsteps that had led Giorgos Karaivaz to his death. The question was, would they suffer the same fate? The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the streets of Athens, yet the chill in the air was not from the setting sun, but from the horrifying realization that one of Greece's most fearless journalists had been silenced. The news of Giorgos Karaivaz's murder spread like wildfire. with major news stations interrupting their scheduled programs to broadcast the assassination. Journalists, activists, and citizens alike were glued to their screens, watching as reporters stood near the cordoned-off crime scene, their voices tense with the weight of what had just happened. The street where Giorgos had lived and died was no longer just another quiet residential area. It had become the epicenter of what would soon be known as one of Greece's most shocking cold cases. Yellow police tape stretched across the pavement, blocking onlookers from getting too close, though the lifeless body had long been taken away by forensic specialists. The pool of blood remained, a gruesome reminder that whoever had orchestrated this killing had meant to send a message. As police officers scoured the scene for evidence, reporters scrambled to piece together the events of the assassination. Within hours, speculation began to spread. Was this the work of organized crime? A political hit? An act of revenge? Those closest to Giorgos knew one thing for sure. This was no random act of violence. It was an execution, carried out with the kind of precision that suggested professional killers were involved. By the evening, the Greek police held a press conference, standing stiffly behind a podium as they assured the public that an investigation was already underway. Yet even as they spoke, there was an unshakable sense of doubt among those who listened. Many suspected that the very people responsible for upholding justice were tangled in the same corruption Giorgos had spent his life exposing. Behind closed doors, officers debated their next move. The security footage from a nearby building had captured the attack, but the killers had been careful. Helmets obscured their faces, their motorcycle was stolen, and no identifiable features could be seen. Witnesses had been too shocked to provide meaningful descriptions beyond the obvious. Two men, dressed in black, acting with chilling efficiency. A few detectives who had followed Giorgos's work over the years knew that this case would not be easy. He had spent decades writing about organized crime, revealing how deep the rot of corruption spread through the government, law enforcement, and the private sector. His reporting had unearthed dangerous secrets, and those secrets had now claimed his life. Despite the growing pressure to produce leads, the investigation stalled within days. Files were delayed, subpoenas ignored, and key witnesses refused to speak. The case, which had initially been the top priority of law enforcement, quickly found itself buried under bureaucratic red tape. Meanwhile, Giorgos's wife, Katerina, was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered life. Their home, once a place of warmth and safety, now felt hollow without him. She barely slept, haunted by the gruesome reality of his murder. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the blood-stained pavement where her husband had fallen. She heard the echoes of the gunshots that had stolen him away. She felt the weight of his absence in every corner of the house. Despite her grief, Katerina refused to stay silent. She made public appeals for justice, appearing on news channels to demand answers. Giorgos dedicated his life to uncovering the truth, she told a reporter through teary eyes. And now I demand the truth about what happened to him. Her words struck a chord with the Greek people. Protests broke out in front of government buildings, with citizens holding signs that read "Justice for Giorgos" and "Journalism is not a crime." The public, though divided on many issues, was united in their outrage over his assassination. Yet even as pressure mounted, those in power remained eerily silent. As the weeks turned into months, interest in the case began to fade. News outlets, once relentless in their coverage, moved on to other stories. The government issued vague statements about ongoing investigations, but there were no arrests, no suspects, and no breakthroughs. It was a story the powerful wanted to disappear, and slowly but surely, it was slipping from the public consciousness. But not everyone was willing to forget. Giorgos's colleagues, those who had worked alongside him, knew that to let his murder go unsolved was to allow fear to win. If those responsible for his assassination remained in the shadows, it meant that every journalist in Greece was at risk. The message would be clear: speak the truth, and you may pay the price. One of his closest friends, Nikos, a fellow investigative reporter, refused to let the story die. He compiled everything Giorgos had been working on before his death: his notes, his unfinished articles, his recorded interviews. What he found only deepened his suspicions. Giorgos had been on the verge of publishing a damning exposé about high-ranking officials with ties to organized crime. If his sources were correct, he had evidence that would shake the very foundation of Greece's leadership. The realization hit Nikos like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a murder. This was a cover-up. And if he wasn't careful, he could be next. As Katerina lit a candle at Giorgos's grave, she whispered a silent promise. "I will not let them bury the truth." She didn't know how, and she didn't know when, but she vowed that her husband's killers would not remain in the shadows forever. The case of Giorgos Karaivaz may have gone cold, but some fires refused to be extinguished. And as long as there were those who remembered him, as long as there were those willing to fight, the truth still had a chance to be uncovered. The only question was, who would be brave enough to continue his work? The days following Giorgos Karaivaz's assassination blurred into a haze of unanswered questions, conflicting narratives, and an overwhelming sense of fear that gripped both the journalistic community and the public. The initial shock of his death had now transformed into cold, calculated silence. The headlines that once screamed in outrage were slowly replaced by newer, less controversial stories. It was as if a collective force was working tirelessly to erase his name from the public discourse. But for those who had known him, those who had worked alongside him and witnessed his relentless pursuit of the truth, forgetting was not an option. If anything, his murder had only amplified the suspicion that what Giorgos had uncovered in his final weeks was so damning that powerful figures had deemed his silence necessary. Nikos, one of his closest colleagues, sat at his cluttered desk in a dimly lit office, sifting through the final notes and files that Giorgos had been working on. The weight of what he was about to do pressed heavily on his chest, but he knew he had no choice. He had to pick up where Giorgos had left off. The files were extensive, filled with coded messages, contact names, hidden accounts, and a pattern that pointed to a disturbing reality. Giorgos had been investigating something much larger than anyone had realized. His notes detailed a network of corruption that spanned beyond organized crime and into the highest levels of law enforcement, politics, and even corporate entities. Nikos's fingers trembled as he turned the pages. If what he was reading was true, then Giorgos had been steps away from revealing one of the biggest scandals in modern Greek history. The implications were staggering. As he continued reading, he found a name that made his blood run cold. It was someone he recognized, someone in the government, someone who had publicly denounced Giorgos's work in the past, calling him a dangerous provocateur. And now Giorgos was dead. Nikos swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. He needed to act fast, but he also needed to be careful. He was no fool. He knew the same forces that had gone after Giorgos would come for anyone who tried to expose them. He reached for his phone, debating whether to call one of his trusted contacts in the press. But something stopped him. He felt like he was being watched. Meanwhile, in a sleek, high-rise office overlooking the city, a man in a tailored suit leaned back in his chair, watching the news on a large screen. His face remained expressionless as the anchor briefly mentioned Karaivaz's name, before moving on to a lighter segment about the upcoming election season. "Just as expected," he murmured, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. Across from him, another man, younger, more anxious, shifted in his seat. "There's still talk," he said cautiously. "People are asking questions. His wife won't stop making statements to the press." The older man smirked. "She's grieving. She'll tire herself out. And the public?" He took a slow sip. "They forget. Always." The younger man hesitated. "And the investigation?" A slow chuckle escaped the older man's lips. "What investigation?" The room fell into silence. The message was clear. The investigation would go nowhere, just like it always had when the right people ensured it. Nikos was no fool. He knew that digging too deep could cost him his life, just as it had cost Giorgos his. But he also knew that stopping now would mean that they had won, that they could continue to operate in the shadows untouchable. He reached for a USB drive, plugging it into his laptop. He began copying Giorgos's files, making backups in multiple locations. He wasn't going to be reckless, but he wasn't going to let this die either. That night, as he locked his office door and stepped onto the street, he pulled his coat tighter around himself. The air was crisp, but something else sent a shiver down his spine. A feeling, a presence. He glanced over his shoulder. A black car was parked across the street. The engine was running, but no headlights were on. The tinted windows made it impossible to see inside. His breath caught in his throat. He turned, forcing himself to walk at a steady pace, not wanting to break into a sprint and confirm that he was afraid. but his instincts screamed at him. He needed to get out of Athens. Fast. The train station was quieter than usual, the late evening air filled with the distant hum of traffic. Nikos clutched his small backpack tightly, its weight a reminder of the responsibility he carried. Inside were Giorgos Karaivaz's notes, his last investigative leads, the secrets that had cost him his life. Nikos had spent years uncovering corruption, but this was different. This wasn't just another case, this was a death sentence waiting to happen. As he approached the ticket counter, he glanced over his shoulder. The black car that had been parked outside his office was nowhere to be seen, but the feeling of being watched had not left him. He had made sure to take a long, indirect route to the station, doubling back through alleyways and slipping into crowded areas. Still, he knew better than to assume he was safe. "Where to?" the clerk asked, barely looking up from his screen. "Thessaloniki." "One way," Nikos replied, his voice steadier than he felt. The clerk tapped on the keyboard, printed his ticket, and handed it over without a second glance. Nikos exhaled slowly and made his way to the platform. The train arrived minutes later, its doors sliding open with a mechanical hiss. He stepped inside, choosing a seat near the back where he could see the entrance. The train jerked forward, pulling out of Athens and into the night. Nikos' pulse slowed slightly, but his mind remained alert. He pulled out his phone and typed a message to an encrypted contact. "Leaving Athens. Have Giorgos's files. Need a secure place to go through them." A few minutes later, a response blinked onto the screen. "Understood. Get to the address I sent earlier. Do not contact anyone else." Nikos locked his phone and slipped it into his pocket. He leaned his head back against the seat, exhaustion creeping in. He hadn't slept in over 24 hours, but there was no time for rest. He had stepped into the fire now, and there was no turning back. Meanwhile, back in Athens, Katerina Karaivaz sat at her kitchen table, staring at the flickering candle in front of her. The shadows danced along the walls, a reminder of the darkness that had seeped into her life. The loss of her husband still felt surreal. One moment he had been there, his presence filling the room with quiet strength. The next he was gone, ripped away by unseen hands, by forces too powerful to fight alone. Her phone buzzed. She hesitated before answering. The caller ID was blocked. "Hello," she said, her voice cautious. A pause. Then a distorted voice came through the line. "Stop asking questions." Her grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" "You don't want to know. Let it go, Mrs. Karaivaz. Walk away before you end up like him." The line went dead. Katerina sat frozen, the weight of the threat settling over her. They were watching. They knew she wasn't giving up, and they wanted to remind her what was at stake. She looked down at her husband's wedding ring, still on her finger, and made a decision. She wouldn't stop. Far from the city, in a dimly lit warehouse near Thessaloniki, two men sat at a metal table, reviewing documents spread out before them. They had been expecting Nikos. They knew what he carried. One of the men, older with graying hair, exhaled deeply. "If he has what we think he has, this changes everything." The younger man nodded. "We need to move fast. If they know he's coming, they'll do whatever it takes to make sure he never gets here." The older man tapped his fingers against the table. "Then we make sure he does." The clock was ticking, and for Nikos, Katerina, and anyone else searching for the truth, the danger was only beginning. The train rattled through the darkness, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks a temporary lullaby for the exhausted Nikos. He hadn't slept properly in days, and the weight of Giorgos Karaivaz's files in his backpack seemed to grow heavier with every passing mile. He shifted in his seat, glancing around the nearly empty train car. A woman sat 2 rows ahead, staring absently out the window. An old man in the corner snored softly. No one seemed to be watching him, but the paranoia in his gut refused to subside. The message he had received earlier still lingered in his mind. "Get to the address I sent earlier. Do not contact anyone else." Whoever was on the other end of that encrypted line, he had no choice but to trust them now. As the train neared Thessaloniki, Nikos pulled his hoodie tighter over his head and gripped his backpack, his fingers tightening over the straps. He needed to get off unnoticed. If he had been followed from Athens, stepping into the open would be dangerous. He waited until the train slowed, watching as the station lights grew closer. At the last moment, he rose, slipping toward the opposite door just as the train came to a stop. He stepped onto the platform and immediately turned right, blending into the sparse crowd. Thessaloniki was colder than Athens, the night air crisp against his skin. He kept his pace steady but unhurried, resisting the urge to look over his shoulder too often. He had studied the map earlier. His destination was an abandoned warehouse near the old docks. A discreet location, but also one that could easily be a trap. He walked for nearly 20 minutes before arriving. The warehouse loomed in the moonlight, rusted metal doors shut tight, graffiti covering parts of the old brick exterior. Nikos hesitated, the fear in his chest twisted tighter. If this was a setup, he had nowhere to run, but standing out in the open was just as dangerous. He took a deep breath and knocked twice. A pause, then a faint shuffle of movement inside. A small slot in the door slid open, revealing a pair of wary eyes. "Who sent you?" a gruff voice demanded. "A mutual friend," Nikos replied, keeping his voice even. "I have information about Giorgos Karaivaz." The eyes studied him for a moment before the slot snapped shut. A second later, the door creaked open just enough for Nikos to slip inside. The dimly lit space smelled of dust and motor oil, a few old crates scattered along the concrete floor. In the center of the room stood two men, both watching him intently. One was the older man he had spoken to before, graying hair, sharp eyes. The other was younger, lean and tense, his fingers twitching near his belt. "You came alone?" the older man asked. "Yes." The younger man exchanged a glance with his companion before nodding toward the table. "Show us what you have." Nikos set his backpack down carefully, unzipping it and pulling out the folders of documents. He spread them across the table, the papers a chaotic mix of financial records, coded messages, and personal notes from Giorgos himself. The older man leaned in, his expression darkening as he scanned the pages. "These names," he muttered. "This isn't just organized crime. This goes all the way up." Nikos nodded. Giorgos was close to exposing them. He had proof that politicians, high-ranking officials, even law enforcement were working with the syndicates. That's why they killed him. The older man exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "If this gets out, it won't just be Greece watching. International agencies will get involved. The people behind this won't let that happen." The younger man spoke up, his voice low. "We need to move fast. If they know we have this, they'll come after us just like they did with Giorgos." Nikos clenched his jaw. He had expected danger, but now it felt more real than ever. "Then we can't hide. We go public. Expose them before they have a chance to silence us." The older man shook his head. "It's not that simple. If we leak this without the right backing, they'll dismiss it as conspiracy theories. We need evidence that can't be ignored. We need more." Nikos swallowed hard. He had barely escaped Athens. Now they were telling him this was just the beginning. "Then we find more," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We finish what Giorgos started." The older man studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then we better move quickly, because we're running out of time." Back in Athens, Katerina Karaivaz sat alone in her darkened apartment, clutching a photo of her husband. Her hands shook not from grief, but from anger. The phone call had confirmed what she already knew. Her husband's death wasn't just another case. It was a warning. She wiped her tears and reached for her phone. She had been a journalist's wife for too long to back down now. If the authorities wouldn't find justice for Giorgos, she would do it herself. She dialed a number she hadn't used in years. "I need your help," she said when the line picked up. "It's time to bring them down." A pause, then a quiet voice on the other end. "Tell me everything." As the city slept, the battle for the truth had begun. The streets of Thessaloniki were quieter than usual, the cool night air filled with the distant sounds of the harbor. Nikos stood outside the warehouse, his heart still pounding from the weight of the conversation that had just taken place. They had the evidence, but evidence alone wouldn't be enough. The people behind Giorgos Karaivaz's murder had connections, power, and the ability to manipulate narratives before the truth could ever reach the public. He tightened the straps of his backpack, feeling the documents pressing against his spine. They were racing against time, and he knew that every second wasted was a second closer to being hunted down. Inside, the older man, known only as Marcos, was already devising a strategy. He had spent years operating in the shadows, gathering intelligence on Greece's most untouchable figures. His network was wide, But even he knew this mission required more than just information. They needed allies. They needed people who couldn't be bought, who wouldn't be intimidated. Marcos placed his palms flat on the table, staring at Nikos. We can't just drop this and hope it goes viral. These men control everything: media, law enforcement, even sections of the government. If we don't do this the right way, we're dead before the truth even gets out. Nikos exhaled sharply, the reality sinking in. Then what do we do? The younger man, Andreas, leaned forward. We need to go deeper. If Giorgos was killed for what he found, that means there's more. Something he didn't get the chance to uncover. If we can find that missing piece, we might have a real shot at forcing this into the light. Marcos nodded. We need to retrace his steps. Where was he in the weeks before his death? Who did he speak to? What leads was he following that made him a target? Nikos pulled out his phone and opened the last few emails Giorgos had sent him. One stood out, a name he hadn't recognized at first: Dimitris Kalogrias. He mentioned meeting someone named Kalogrias, Nikos said, sliding his phone across the table. Said he had information that could break the whole case wide open. But Giorgos never told me what it was. And now he's dead. Marcos frowned. I know that name. Kalogrias was a mid-level fixer, a go-between for politicians and criminal syndicates. If he was talking, it meant he was scared. And if he's still alive, that means someone wants him quiet. Andreas stood, grabbing his jacket. Then we find him before they do. Across the city, in a dimly lit apartment, Katerina Karaivaz sat with her contact, a former police investigator named Stavros. He had left the force years ago, disgusted by the corruption that had seeped into every level of the system. But now he was back in the game, because this wasn't just any case. This was personal. Stavros leaned forward, studying the list of names Katerina had compiled. These men, I've heard whispers about some of them. The kind of whispers that get people killed. Katerina's jaw tightened. They killed my husband. I don't care how powerful they are. I want them exposed. Stavros nodded slowly. Then we do this properly. We gather what we can. We make sure when we strike, there's no way for them to bury it. Katerina met his gaze, her voice firm. Then we better move fast. Because I have a feeling they already know we're coming. Hours later, Nikos and Andreas arrived at an old mechanic's shop on the outskirts of the city. The metal shutters were pulled down, but a single light glowed from inside. Nikos knocked twice, then once more in a rhythmic pattern. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, revealing a gaunt man with sunken eyes and a face lined with paranoia. Dimitris Kalogrias? Nikos asked. The man hesitated before nodding. Who wants to know? We're here because of Giorgos Karaivaz. At the mention of the name, Kalogrias stiffened. His eyes darted past them to check the street before he stepped back, motioning for them to enter. The door shut behind them with a heavy clang. You shouldn't have come here, Kalogrias muttered, pacing the small room. You have no idea what you're getting yourselves into. Andreas crossed his arms. Then tell us. Kalogrias exhaled shakily, running a hand through his unkempt hair. I was supposed to meet Giorgos a few days before he was killed. He had something big. I don't know what exactly, but he said it was the final piece. Nikos narrowed his eyes. And you didn't think to come forward after he was murdered? Kalogrias let out a bitter laugh. Come forward? To who? The police? The same people who are on their payroll? I'd be dead before I finished my sentence. Andreas stepped closer. So why are you still alive? Kalogrias swallowed hard. Because I didn't tell them everything. They think I don't know enough to be a threat. But if you're here, that means you have the rest of it. Nikos pulled out a small flash drive and held it up. We do. But we need what you have too. Kalogrias hesitated, then nodded slowly. All right, but if we're doing this, we do it my way. Because trust me, they're already watching. The room fell silent. They had the key to Giorgos's final discovery. But now they had to figure out how to use it before it got them all killed. And time was running out. The weight of what they had uncovered pressed heavily on Nikos's shoulders as he and Andreas left the mechanic's shop. Dimitris Kalogrias had given them more than just information. He had given them a target. A name. Someone who had been working in the shadows, pulling strings to keep the truth buried. The name was Leonidas Vretos. Vretos wasn't just another corrupt politician or businessman. He was a power broker, a man who operated outside the reach of law enforcement, protected by the very people meant to uphold justice. His name had come up in Giorgos Karaivaz's investigation multiple times, but there had never been anything concrete, until now. As they walked toward their car, Nikos couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The street was empty, save for the occasional passing vehicle, but his instincts screamed at him. They were in dangerous territory now. "We need to move fast," Andreas said as they reached the car. Kalogrias made it clear. "If Redos finds out we're digging into him, we won't get another chance." Nikos nodded and slid into the driver's seat. "We have to be smart about this. We can't just confront him. We need leverage." Andreas pulled out his phone. Kalogrias said he had access to encrypted emails between Redos and key players in the syndicate. If we can get those emails, we can prove that Giorgos was on the verge of exposing him. Nikos started the engine and pulled onto the road. "Then that's our next move. But we need to be careful. Redos isn't the type to leave loose ends." Meanwhile, in Athens, Katerina Karaivaz sat across from Stavros in a dimly lit cafe. She had spent the last few days going through her late husband's files, and the deeper she went, the more she realized how much danger he had been in. Stavros leaned forward, his voice low. "You understand what this means, don't you? If your husband was killed to protect Redos, then the people behind this are more powerful than we thought." Katerina clenched her fists. "That doesn't mean we stop." Stavros studied her for a moment before nodding. "Then we need proof. Something that can't be denied, something that forces the authorities to act." Katerina took a deep breath. "I think I know where to start." Nikos and Andreas arrived at a small apartment complex on the outskirts of Thessaloniki. Kalogrias had told them this was where the encrypted files were stored. The apartment belonged to an old friend of Giorgos, someone who had been helping him keep his research hidden. They knocked twice, a pause, then once more. The door opened a crack, revealing a tired-looking man in his 50s with wary eyes. "You're here for the files," he said. Nikos nodded. "We don't have much time." The man hesitated before stepping aside and letting them in. The apartment was cluttered but filled with stacks of documents, hard drives, and old newspapers. He led them to a small desk with a laptop already open. "These are the emails," he said, pointing at the screen. "They're heavily encrypted, but I've been working on breaking them." Andreas leaned over, scanning the screen. "How much longer?" The man exhaled. "A few more hours. Maybe less." Nikos clenched his jaw. "Then we wait." But as they settled in, the nagging feeling of being watched returned. Outside, in the distance, the headlights of a black SUV flickered through the blinds. They weren't alone. The hunt had begun. The dim glow of the laptop screen illuminated the cramped apartment as Nikos, Andreas, and their contact watched the decryption process inch toward completion. Outside, the black SUV remained parked across the street, its occupants hidden behind tinted windows. The silence in the room was thick with tension. "We don't have much time," Nikos muttered, glancing out through the blinds. "Whoever they are, they're waiting for something." Andreas clenched his fists. They could be waiting for us to lead them to something, or someone. Their contact, still typing furiously, let out a slow breath. "I'm almost there. Just keep watch." Nikos' mind raced. If these files contained what they hoped, direct proof of Redos' involvement in Giorgos Karaivaz's murder, then their enemies would do anything to keep it buried. He pulled his phone out and sent a single message to Katerina. "We found something. Be ready." In Athens, Katerina sat in her car outside a government building, staring at the entrance. She knew she was being watched, had been, ever since she refused to let Giorgos' murder fade into obscurity. But she had learned from her husband's work. Fear was a weapon, and she refused to let them use it against her. Her phone buzzed. Nikos' message. Her breath hitched as she read it. If they had found proof, real proof, then it was time to make a move. She started her engine and pulled out into the street, her destination clear. She needed to find Stavros. He was the only one who could ensure this evidence reached the right hands, if such hands even existed anymore. Back in Thessaloniki, the laptop chimed. "It's done," their contact whispered. Nikos and Andreas leaned in, scanning the screen. Line after line of emails, transaction logs, and meeting records filled the document. It was worse than they had imagined. Redos wasn't just covering up corruption. He was orchestrating it. Payments to law enforcement officials, bribes to politicians, connections to criminal syndicates. And buried deep within the messages was an order dated just days before Giorgos Karaivaz's murder. Eliminate the problem. Ensure no loose ends. Nikos swallowed hard. This is it. Andreas pulled out a flash drive, quickly transferring the files. We need to get out of here now. A knock on the door shattered the tense silence. 3 short taps. Then another. Nikos froze. No one else knew they were here. The man at the laptop paled. That's not a good sign. Andreas reached for his gun, but Nikos stopped him. We don't know who it is. Another knock. This time more insistent. Then the door handle turned. Whoever was outside wasn't planning on waiting any longer. The doorknob twisted with slow, deliberate pressure. Whoever was on the other side wasn't here by accident. They were waiting for the right moment to strike. Nikos locked eyes with Andreas, his breath shallow. The older man at the laptop quickly shut the device, yanking out the flash drive. The air in the apartment felt stifling, thick with tension. There was no way out except through that door, or the window, 3 stories above solid pavement. Another knock. This time harder, more impatient. Andreas reached for his gun, tensing as Nikos signaled for silence. The 3 men stood frozen, listening. The seconds dragged like hours. Then, the doorknob stopped moving. Heavy footsteps retreated down the hallway. A moment of relief washed over them, before the sound of splintering would fill the air. Bang! The door crashed open. A masked figure burst through first, armed with a silenced pistol, sweeping the room with predatory precision. Behind him, another man, taller, broader, eyes scanning the apartment with military discipline. Their weapons were drawn, their intent clear, no witnesses. Andreas reacted first. He fired. The shot cracked through the apartment, hitting the first intruder square in the chest. The man staggered but didn't fall, his body armor absorbing most of the impact. The second attacker lunged forward, returning fire. A bullet tore into the wall inches from Nikos' head as he dove for cover. Move! Andreas shouted, pushing their contact toward the window. Nikos grabbed the flash drive and shoved it into his pocket, his heart hammering. The wounded intruder raised his weapon, but Andreas shot him again, this time in the head. The man crumpled, lifeless. The second gunman didn't hesitate. He pivoted, squeezing the trigger, his bullet grazing Andreas' shoulder. Blood spattered the floor as Andreas gritted his teeth, returning fire. The assassin ducked, rolling toward cover, and Nikos seized his chance. He lunged for the laptop, smashing it against the floor. If they couldn't take it with them, no one would. Go! Nikos yelled. Their contact threw open the window, hesitation flashing across his face. 3 stories was a long way down, but staying was a death sentence. More gunfire erupted behind them. The second attacker, now cornered but relentless, fired wildly as he attempted to retreat. Bullets shattered glass, tore through furniture. Nikos felt something sting his arm but ignored it, adrenaline pushing him forward. One by one, they jumped. The impact was brutal. Nikos hit the ground hard, pain jolting up his legs, but he forced himself up. Andreas landed next, wincing but still standing. Their contact groaned, clutching his ankle, sprained but not broken. Above them, footsteps pounded toward the window. More were coming. Run! They took off down the alley, the sounds of sirens in the distance. Nikos barely had time to think, his focus singular. Get out, stay ahead, don't look back. And yet, he knew this wasn't over. Whoever had sent those men wasn't done with them yet. The real fight was only beginning. The rain had started falling by the time Nikos, Andreas, and their wounded contact reached the outskirts of the city. Their clothes were soaked, their bodies aching from the impact of the jump, but stopping wasn't an option. They had barely escaped with their lives, and whoever had sent those assassins would not stop hunting them now. Andreas pressed a hand to his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. His face was pale, but his jaw was clenched in determination. We need a safe place. Somewhere they won't look. Nikos pulled out his phone, fingers trembling as he sent a coded message to Katerina. We were ambushed. Safe house compromised. Need extraction. A response came almost immediately. Go to the old docks. Warehouse 17. I'll meet you there. Andreas gave a sharp nod. Then that's where we're going. In Athens, Katerina slammed her phone onto the table, her mind racing. She had been prepared for pushback, but this was something else. Whoever was orchestrating this cover-up wasn't just trying to silence them. They were erasing every trace of Giorgos' investigation, eliminating anyone connected to it. Stavros, the former investigator, paced nearby. This is escalating faster than I expected. If they're willing to send hit squads, that means you're closer to the truth than they're comfortable with. Katerina exhaled sharply. We need to go public now. If we wait any longer, they'll find a way to bury this for good. Stavros frowned. Not yet. If we release what we have without securing our people, they'll be hunted down one by one. We need to hit them where it hurts. Give them something so undeniable that they can't make it disappear. Katerina clenched her fists. Then we need more proof. Stavros nodded grimly. And I think I know where to find it. Nikos and Andreas reached the docks just before midnight, their breath visible in the frigid air. Warehouse 17 loomed ahead, its rusted doors barely holding together. They knocked in the prearranged pattern, two slow, one fast. The door creaked open and Katerina stepped back, letting them inside. Her eyes widened when she saw Andreas wound. You're hurt, she said, already grabbing a medical kit. Andreas waved her off. It's nothing. Nikos pulled out the flash drive. We got it. The emails, the money trails, everything tying Vredos to Giorgos' murder. But they know we have it. They sent killers after us. Katerina's grip on the medical kit tightened. Then we use it now. We expose him before he can silence anyone else. Andreas shook his head. It's not enough. We need more. We need something so explosive that even his allies will turn on him. Stavros stepped forward. I might have exactly what we need. Everyone turned to him. I know where Vredos keeps his insurance policy, documents, recordings, blackmail material. If we can get our hands on that, we'll have enough leverage to bring his entire operation down. Nikos narrowed his eyes. Where? Stavros hesitated before saying, in the vault beneath his private estate. A silence settled over the group. Breaking into the home of one of the most powerful men in Greece was suicide. But at this point, it was their only chance. The tension in the warehouse was suffocating. The faint hum of the city beyond the docks felt like another world. One where people carried on with their lives, oblivious to the war raging in the shadows. Nikos leaned against a rusted metal shelf, running a hand through his damp hair. The enormity of what they were about to do pressed down on him like a crushing weight. Breaking into the estate of Leonidas Vredos was nothing short of madness. The man was untouchable, surrounded by security, protected by layers of corruption so thick that no one dared to challenge him. And yet here they were preparing to do exactly that. Katerina paced near the entrance, arms crossed tightly over her chest. We need a plan, she said, her voice firm. A real one, not just running in and hoping we get lucky. Stavros exhaled slowly. I can get us inside. I worked cases involving Vredos' security team years ago. He rotates his guards every 2 weeks, but some of the internal staff stay longer. I still have a contact, a man who owes me more than a few favors. Andreas frowned. And you trust him? No, Stavros admitted. But I trust that he values his own survival. If we offer him a way out, he might help us. Nikos pushed away from the shelf, his mind racing. Let's say we get inside. What exactly are we looking for? Stavros turned to Katerina. You said Giorgos kept files on Vredos' blackmail operations. If we find those, we'll have leverage. If we find something bigger, something that links him directly to murder, trafficking, or worse, we can bring the entire system down. Katerina nodded. Giorgos always said that men like Vredos don't just protect themselves with money. They collect secrets. He has something that keeps his allies in line, something so dangerous that no one dares to betray him. Andreas let out a low whistle. And we're going to steal it. Nikos clenched his fists. Yes, because if we don't, we're dead anyway. The next night, under the cover of darkness, the group approached Vredos' estate. The sprawling mansion sat on the outskirts of Athens, surrounded by high stone walls and dense forests. Security cameras tracked every entrance, motion sensors lined the perimeter, and armed guards patrolled the grounds. They had one shot. Stavros' contact had given them a narrow window between guard rotations when the estate was at its most vulnerable. Once we're inside, we move fast, Stavros whispered. No unnecessary risks. If we don't find what we need in 30 minutes, we get out. Katerina adjusted the small earpiece linked to their getaway driver. Understood. Andreas checked his firearm. Let's do this. Nikos took a deep breath, steadying himself. For Giorgos. With that, they slipped into the shadows, moving toward the estate that held the secrets capable of bringing everything crashing down. The night air was thick with tension as Nikos, Andreas, Katerina, and Stavros crouched behind the dense hedges bordering Leonidas Breto's sprawling estate. The mansion loomed in the distance, its high walls and security systems a testament to the wealth and power of the man inside. This was no ordinary residence. It was a fortress designed to keep people like them out. Stavros adjusted the earpiece connected to their driver, parked a few blocks away in an unmarked van. "We move now. The outer patrol just switched rotations. We have 4 minutes." Nikos exhaled slowly, gripping the rope he carried. "Then let's go." Andreas was the first to move, sprinting low to the ground until he reached the stone wall. Without hesitation, he tossed the rope over, the hooked end catching onto the ledge above. He climbed swiftly, his training evident in his precision. As soon as he reached the top, he secured the rope for the rest of them. One by one, they climbed over, landing silently in the neatly manicured garden below. The scent of fresh-cut grass mixed with the faint aroma of cigars wafting from an open balcony above. The house was alive despite the late hour. They had expected that. Men like Breto's didn't sleep early. Katerina clutched a small flashlight, keeping it off for now, but ready. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but her resolve didn't waver. This was for Giorgos. "Service entrance," Stavros whispered, pointing toward a narrow doorway near the side of the mansion. "It leads to the kitchen. Fewer guards." They moved swiftly, pressing against the walls as they approached the entrance. Stavros produced a small tool from his belt and went to work on the lock. The seconds stretched unbearably long before a soft click signaled their way inside. The door opened, revealing the gleaming stainless steel counters of an industrial kitchen. The space was empty save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the lingering scent of expensive wine. They slipped inside, moving carefully toward the main hallway. "This way," Stavros whispered, leading them past the dining room. Ornate chandeliers cast dim golden light over the polished marble floors. Nikos spotted a security camera ahead. "Wait!" He reached into his bag, pulling out a small device. He aimed it at the camera and pressed a button. The red light blinked off, jammed temporarily. They moved deeper into the estate, the walls lined with expensive paintings and glass cases filled with rare artifacts. Breto's didn't just hoard money, he collected power, history, influence. And somewhere in this house, he kept secrets that could bring it all crashing down. "The vault is in his office," Stavros murmured. "Second floor. End of the east wing." They reached the staircase, pausing to listen. Footsteps echoed above. A guard. Andreas motioned for silence. The guard's pace was slow, methodical. Routine. When he disappeared around the corner, they moved. Up the stairs, each step carefully measured. The hallway stretched long and quiet, doors lining each side. At the very end, a heavy wooden door stood half open. The office. Stavros led the way, pushing inside and immediately heading toward the bookshelf along the back wall. "The vault is behind here," he said, pulling at a specific volume. A click echoed through the room, and the shelf slid open, revealing a steel door embedded into the wall. A keypad blinked beside it. Katerina felt her throat tighten. "Can you open it?" Stavros nodded. "It'll take time." He pulled a small device from his pack, attaching it to the keypad. The screen flashed numbers as it began decoding the lock. Minutes passed in silence, each second agonizingly slow. Then, a sharp creak from the hallway. Nikos turned just in time to see a shadow moving behind the glass panels of the office door. And then, the alarm blared to life. Red lights flashed as a robotic voice echoed through the house. Security breach detected. Footsteps thundered toward them. They had been caught, and now there was no turning back. The shrill alarm echoed through the halls of the mansion, drowning out everything else. Nikos' breath hitched as he spun toward the door, his mind racing. Heavy footsteps thundered toward them, accompanied by the unmistakable metallic sound of weapons being drawn. "We're out of time," Andreas growled, gripping his pistol. Stavros' fingers flew over the device attached to the vault keypad. Just a few more seconds. Katerina stood frozen for a moment before forcing herself to move. She grabbed a heavy chair and wedged it under the doorknob. It wouldn't hold for long, but it would buy them a few precious seconds. A loud bang rattled the door as a guard tried to force it open. "Hurry, Stavros!" Nikos shouted, glancing at the security monitor on the desk. Red dots moved rapidly toward their location. They weren't just sending a few guards. Vretos was mobilizing his entire security force. The keypad beeped, and Stavros exhaled sharply as the lock disengaged with a soft click. "We're in!" Andreas yanked the vault door open, revealing rows of neatly organized files, hard drives, and stacks of cash. But none of that mattered. They needed the real evidence, the one thing that could bring Vretos down. Katerina's eyes darted over the shelves, searching for something, anything that stood out. And then she saw it, a black leather-bound journal, tucked away in a small locked box. It looked old, well-worn, as if it had been handled many times before. "This has to be it," she whispered, reaching for it. Andreas used his knife to snap the lock, flipping the book open. Pages filled with dates, names, bank transfers, everything they needed. "This is the kill list," Stavros muttered, his face pale. "It's not just bribery. This details every political hit, every silenced journalist, every judge and police chief on Vretos' payroll." Nikos shoved the journal into his backpack. "We have what we came for. Now we need to get out." Another crash at the door. The chair splintered, the wood cracking under the pressure. "Go!" Katerina urged. Stavros grabbed a flash drive from one of the vault's compartments. "This has to be the digital backups," he muttered, shoving it into his pocket. The door finally burst open. Armed guards stormed in, weapons raised. Andreas fired first, dropping one of the men before ducking behind the vault door for cover. Nikos grabbed Katerina's wrist and pulled her toward the balcony door. "We can't fight our way out. We need another exit." Stavros scanned the room, his mind racing. "There's a fire escape outside the west wing. We can make it if we move now." Bullets tore through the walls as the team scrambled. Katerina clutched the evidence to her chest as they ran, their only hope resting in the damning information they had just stolen. But getting in had been the easy part. Now they had to survive getting out. The gunfire followed them as they bolted down the hallway, the echoing cracks reverberating through the vast mansion. Nikos gritted his teeth, gripping Katerina's wrist tightly as they sprinted toward the western wing. Andreas and Stavros covered their retreat, firing in short, precise bursts to slow the guards who were now flooding into the office. "The fire escape should be just ahead," Stavros shouted, pointing toward a set of double doors at the end of the corridor. Andreas reloaded as they ran, his breathing sharp and controlled. "We won't make it if they cut us off downstairs. We need a diversion." Nikos glanced back. "We don't have explosives. What do you suggest?" Andreas smirked. "We make some noise." He stopped in his tracks and fired at a large, ornate chandelier hanging above the hallway. The heavy glass structure shattered, crashing down in a violent explosion of shards and debris, momentarily blocking their pursuers. "Go, go, go!" Andreas barked. They reached the fire escape door. Stavros shoved it open, revealing a narrow metal staircase leading down to the darkened gardens. Rain had started to fall, making the metal slick beneath their feet. Katerina clutched the journal to her chest as she climbed down as fast as she could. Nikos followed, keeping a hand on the railing for balance. Andreas and Stavros covered them from above, firing sporadically before quickly descending after them. The moment their feet hit the ground, the mansion's security floodlights blazed to life, illuminating the gardens like a stage. More guards swarmed onto the balconies above, rifles raised. "Run!" Stavros shouted. They dashed toward the tree line, dodging the bullets that ripped into the wet grass around them. Their getaway driver, a trusted contact named Theo, was waiting just beyond the trees in a black SUV, engine running. As they neared the vehicle, Theo threw the passenger door open. "Get in!" Nikos yanked the door open and shoved Katerina inside. Andreas and Stavros dove into the back seat, slamming the door just as Theo hit the gas, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. Bullets slammed into the vehicle's reinforced frame, but the SUV held. They sped down the narrow road, away from the estate, away from Vretos' reach, at least for now. Everyone was breathing hard, adrenaline still surging through their veins. Katerina clutched the journal, her fingers trembling. "We did it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding rain outside. Nikos exchanged a look with Andreas. "We got out, but it's not over." Stavros checked the flash drive in his pocket, his expression dark. Now we take this to the world. Theo glanced at them through the rearview mirror. Then we better find a safe place to do it, because Vredos won't stop hunting you now. As the SUV disappeared into the stormy night, they all knew this was just the beginning of the final battle for the truth. The SUV tore through the winding mountain roads, the city lights of Athens fading behind them. Rain lashed against the windshield as Theo gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. The weight of what they had stolen from Vredos' estate sat heavy in the back seat. Katerina clutching the journal, Stavros holding the flash drive containing the digital proof of decades of corruption, bribery, and political assassinations. "Where are we heading?" Nikos asked, his voice tight. "The safe house outside Delphi," Theo answered, eyes locked on the rearview mirror. "It's off the grid. No cameras, no cell reception. If we stay in Athens, we're dead by sunrise." Katerina exhaled slowly. "We don't have time to hide. We need to get this out now." Nikos nodded. "She's right. If we wait, they'll cover their tracks, eliminate loose ends. We need to take this straight to the press." Theo glanced at them in the mirror. "And which journalist do you trust with this?" Silence filled the car. After what had happened to Giorgos Karaivaz, they all knew the answer. "There's one man," Stavros said finally. "Christos Leventis. He's one of the last real investigative journalists in Greece. If anyone has the guts to run this story, it's him." Andreas scoffed. "If he's still alive by morning." Theo took a sharp turn, the SUV skidding slightly before regaining traction. "We can't go to his office. It'll be under surveillance." Katerina straightened. "His wife runs a bookstore in Nafplio. He sometimes meets sources there." Stavros nodded. "That's our best shot. We get there before dawn." Hours later, they pulled into a deserted alley behind the small bookstore. The rain had slowed, the first hints of dawn creeping over the horizon. Theo killed the engine, and they sat in silence for a moment, catching their breath. "This is it," Nikos murmured. "No turning back." They stepped out of the car cautiously, scanning the empty streets. Katerina clutched the journal tightly as they approached the door. Stavros knocked, 2 short raps, then a pause, then one more. The door opened slightly, revealing a weary, middle-aged woman with deep-set eyes. She studied them for a long moment before stepping aside. "He's in the back." They followed her inside, the scent of old books and ink filling the air. Christos Leventis sat at a wooden table, papers and notes spread before him. His sharp eyes flicked up as they entered. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said, gesturing for them to sit. Katerina placed the journal on the table. "This is everything. Names, dates, payoffs, murders. Proof that Vredos has been running the biggest criminal empire in Greece from the shadows." Leventis reached for the book, flipping through the pages. His expression darkened as he skimmed the evidence. "My God," he muttered. "This isn't just corruption. This is systemic control." Stavros slid the flash drive across the table. "This is all the digital records. Bank transactions, intercepted emails. It confirms everything." Leventis leaned back, exhaling. "If I run this, they will come for me." Katerina met his gaze. "They already came for Giorgos. If we don't stop them now, they'll keep killing until there's no one left to fight." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Leventis nodded. "I'll need time to verify everything. A day at most." "We don't have a day," Andreas warned. "Vredos knows we took something. It won't take long before he figures out who we're giving it to." Leventis rubbed his chin. "Then we go public immediately." He pulled out his phone and began dialing. "I have a contact at Reuters. If we push this through international media, it'll be harder for them to suppress." Katerina felt her heart race. This was it. The moment Giorgos had fought for. The moment he had died for. Leventis looked at them again. "You need to disappear for a while. If this story breaks, there will be consequences." Nikos swallowed hard. "We've already made our choice." Leventis stood. "Then it's time." The next 24 hours were a blur. By sunrise, the files had been sent to major international media outlets. By noon, the first reports had surfaced. Leaked documents reveal massive corruption scandal in Greece, spreading like wildfire. By nightfall, protests erupted in Athens demanding justice. And by morning, Leonidas Vredos was missing. The government denied involvement, but whispers circulated that he had fled the country. Some said he had been taken out by his own associates to keep him from talking. Others believed he had simply vanished into the underground world he had helped create. For Nikos, Andreas, Katerina, and Stavros, there was no celebration, no victory parade. They had survived, but they knew the battle wasn't truly over. The machine they had exposed wouldn't crumble overnight, and new players would rise to take Reto's place. But for the first time in a long time, the truth had won. And Giorgos Karaivaz's fight had not been in vain. As they stood on a quiet beach, watching the waves crash against the shore, Katerina closed her eyes, whispering into the wind. "We did it, Giorgos.